Apology from La Condesa, Part 4. At age 16, I was open, available, and willing for whatever God may have for me. And I had placed my bet on living for Jesus Christ, dedicating my life to ministry. I trusted that if I followed him, that everything else would fall into place and that he would take care of me and reveal himself to me. I had open hands to serve at my home church and in my youth ministry. And I was also looking for opportunities to work in charity, helping people in need. Thus, I began regularly volunteering in my neighborhood church's food pantry. And I had also connected with an old saint that would drive around all night picking up unsold pizzas, sandwiches, baked goods, etc. And after church, this man, Pizza Tim, would open up his car to reveal a car overflowing with all the food he had picked up. And I would take as much as I could and deliver food to people that needed it. At age 16, I started an outreach ministry to visit the many motels where people that were homeless or struggling with addiction or immigrant families were staying. I went door to door at crack motels to offer free food and soap and shampoo, etc., and to tell them about Jesus. I offered to pray for them and I invited them to church. I tried to get others to help. And over the years, I invited many churches and nonprofits to participate. I explained that if they built relationships and sent out a van to the island, seaside, they would easily get plenty of people who would come to church and follow Jesus and get connected to rehabilitation or whatever they needed. They ignored the desperate needs of our neighbors who were suffering in food insecurity, isolation, mental health crises, and those on the brink of suicide or drug overdoses, should there be no intervention. I had followed some of our older youth leaders to join an additional youth ministry at another church. And hearing my profession of faith, the pastor of that Assemblies of God church baptized me at a Sunday service in a middle school cafeteria at age 16. I began serving in ministry through bringing a car full of teenagers to youth ministry every week so that they could hear the gospel and make friends. I continued attending multiple youth groups, especially spending time with the wallflowers, that is, the lonely or quiet ones on the side, asking them about their lives, coloring pictures of unicorns and rainbows, and sharing the hope of the gospel. I consistently attended Bible studies on Fridays, and one night I was invited to go to this coffee house where a leader I knew, Pastor Ant, was preaching a sermon. It turned out to be a small chapel in the middle of the woods at 11 p.m. When my friends and I arrived, all the seats were taken, and so we sat on the floor in the foyer. When the sermon was over, I walked around, seeing a relaxed atmosphere with a bunch of mismatched couches, side tables, candles, baked goods, and coffee. The people there were almost all young adults, from college age to 30 somethings. And I was warmly greeted by a number of people that welcomed me back for next week. I saw my neighbor there, a kind redhead girl my age, and asked for a ride to be able to attend in the future. And her family continued kindly giving me rides for the next couple of years. Pastor Ant came from a background of living on the streets, and he was involved in drugs and living for himself. But eventually, he came to follow Jesus at some church in Florida. As a young adult, he committed his life to seeking Jesus and to consistently serving people in need. We met when I was 15, when he was my youth leader, and we went out for burgers together, and he continued to be in my life on and off for the next decade. Pastor Ant was always available to talk, and he gave me rides and he offered me a place to stay, and he was one of the few who donated toward our young adult ministry. He served at BOTR for years and then continued as a pastor at the church in Florence. Pastor Ant set an example of radical sacrifice for Jesus, and few people saw how much he humbly and generously served for the sake of the gospel. I'm grateful that he was one of my leaders I got to serve with and spend time with. The group at this little chapel, BOTR, was attractive because there were so many younger people that seemed to be on fire for Jesus. And they were friendly, inviting, welcoming, and were happy to offer me rides. Like the H family, or Steve, or Jeff, or Pastor Nate. They treated me with more respect than I had received anywhere before. Perhaps in part because they thought that I was something like 5 years older than I was. This was different from my previous church experiences, in which, with some exceptions, either nobody noticed me or nobody cared, or I was treated as a burden or maybe a troublemaker. After a few months, I began visiting this little chapel in the woods on Sunday mornings, and it was profoundly different than what I had experienced from churches before. The building and the parking lot were packed, and many people needed to stand or sit on the floors to be in the church. The service was exciting with hearty singing, fun songs, and we even had cheesy dance moves to go along with the worship music. The place had a ton of young people, including folks visiting from other countries like France or Cameroon or Chile. It seemed that here there was a real passion to serve God and reach people with the gospel in our community and around the world. There were so many friendly and genuinely welcoming people that were happy to serve, stacking chairs, vacuuming the carpet, taking out the trash to the glory of God. There was an overall aura of excitement and joy that permeated through the people at this little chapel in the woods called Building on the Rock, BOTR. At age 16, I decided to make it my home church. And though I was a socially anxious introvert, I took a leap of faith and jumped in to get involved, serving on the usher team and youth group in children's church, preparing food and coffee, and regularly attending Bible studies, outreaches, and whatever I could get to. Meanwhile, while I was at my original youth group at Gap, I continued attending there for 6 years, but I felt increasingly isolated over time, especially in the larger church and Sunday services. There were a few kind people, but I didn't really fit in. The church was Pentecostal and had people speaking in tongues and declaring healing and such, which I was open to, but which never made sense to me. And while I had shifted away from nationalism, the quasi-religious devotion to the US federal government, its symbols, its violence, usually combined with a belief in exceptionalism, this church was heavily entrenched in it. They would wave US flags, sing songs of devotion to the government, and praise the US military. This didn't sit right with me. And I openly criticized this type of behavior both in person and social media. I said, God loves all people. The Venezuelan is my brother. The Cambodian is my sister. I desire the well-being of all people, not only those in some arbitrary geographical region of the continent where I was born. And I had sought to be a leader in that youth ministry as I was eager to learn and to lead. But I was told that due to my advocacy for peace and disobedience to my parents, that it wouldn't happen. It was at youth group at Gap at age 17 that I met a girl, Faye, who was unbelievably adorable and authentic, sweet and silly and passionate about Jesus. We would talk regularly about our lives. We joked together and eventually spent time with each other outside of church. I took a bus to her town. We took a bike ride. We flew a kite. We laid in the grass and we chatted for hours. We would text each other consistently and be supportive of what each of us were experiencing. One day before youth group, we were together and I told her, I like you. And she said, I like you. I asked if I could hold her hand, and we held hands and we admired each other for what felt like years, but what was only a few minutes. All the amazing, overwhelming butterflies in your stomach feelings arose within me. And I asked if she wanted to be boyfriend and girlfriend, to which she gladly agreed. And we had a beautiful relationship for 4 years. Every moment with Kay was incredible, and I adored everything about her. It was an all-consuming experience of young teenage love, and the honeymoon phase never ended while we were together. While I had some genuine and reliable friends before, I never really knew what a true best friend was until Kay was in my life. She was always available, caring, nurturing, supportive, with an endless supply of affection. We would take walks and watch movies and hold hands, cook meals, and go to church together as much as possible. We felt safe together, and she would continue being someone I could rely on, talk to, cry with, pray alongside, and love. Kay, more than anyone else, would help me get through what would come to be the darkest period of my life. I'm tremendously grateful for the privilege of having Kay in my life. Kay is one of the most beautiful souls I've ever encountered, and the world isn't worthy of her. I hope she lives a tremendously purposeful and intentional life. In 2016, I worked throughout the summer as the overnight front desk worker at my local Planet Fitness, showing up at midnight and staying until 6 a.m. This was a fun idea at first, and I would be alone, lifting weights and walking on stair climbers for hours in the middle of the night. But typically, there would be no one there from 1 to 4 a.m., except a guy wearing a towel over his head or the occasional swingers in an RV out front. I quit Planet Fitness as the summer ended, but the lack of sleep would affect me for the rest of the year. I had time to think, process, and being quiet in my thoughts recognized a deep sense of existential dread and despair, which I was feeling for years. But it was around then that I recognized it and named it. It was then that I happened to read an article about something called aphantasia. The people with this condition were incapable of seeing pictures in their brain. I sat there confused for a few minutes, wondering whether there were really people that see images in their brain or even movies in their mind's eye. I began searching the topic for the next hour, and I realized that I apparently was the odd one out. Most people could picture a rainbow or a friend or a cat. Most people could see the castles and waterfalls described in books. Most people daydream. They visualize their friends, their hopes, their futures. I do not. This realization helped me to understand why I didn't enjoy fiction books and why all the visualization techniques of English classes or Pentecostals sounded like nonsense. Perhaps it was all a relevant factor in my spiritual experiences or lack thereof. But one of the benefits I learned is that I'm incapable of seeing negative imagery. I don't feel like I've had extremely traumatic experiences, but whatever negative memories I do have, they are remembered as like concrete historical facts. I'm incapable of reliving them in any vivid way that often brings pain to so many people. I'm also incapable of visualizing people in a unhealthy or sinful way, whichever that may be. While aphantasia didn't stop me from being an honors student or having accomplishments, I feel like it made it much more challenging to write fictional narratives or sensory descriptions and to do any type of advanced math, which seems to require holding or seeing numbers in your mind's eye. Aphantasia also makes me much more accustomed to improvisation, as I have trouble tangibly planning things out, such as where the chairs or tables go in a classroom. That said, it's worth noting that in this story, you ought to expect to focus more on words and questions and experiences rather than physical scenery, places, and body language. I'm not going to describe sensory details because, from my perspective, they're irrelevant. Realizing that I was missing out on this common human experience was part of what sent me deeper into existential anxiety through 2016. At Gap Church, I met Colin, who was known for loving the Lord and loving the poor, the broken, the hurting, and especially those struggling with homelessness and addiction. He had been organizing homeless ministry for years and building unity amongst the churches and building bridges of understanding amongst the Orthodox Jewish OJ community. These are all areas I wanted to be involved in. Why? Because when you learn what Jesus said, what Jesus did, and what Jesus called his followers to do, you can't help but see that caring for the poor is central to what it means to be a Christian. And because God loves me, I can't help but go love others, especially those most in need of love or those who are different from me. As Jesus says in Matthew 25, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. I accompanied Colin as he visited homeless folks, and he taught me about the homelessness crisis. He explained the multiple aspects of how we could practically end homelessness in Ocean County, New Jersey, my home. I was completely committed and I wanted to step up to do whatever I could with what I had. As soon as I got my driver's license, I decided I would be open, available, and willing to whatever opportunities God would place in front of me. God blessed me with a car, and I was committed to use it for His glory. And I didn't think much about money because I had faith that God would provide whatever would be needed to those who had faith. In the style of George Mueller, who ran an orphanage and trusted God would supply every need. I never saw God meet the needs that I daily begged Him for. Driving around town, I would pray for God to put opportunities in my path. I would meet people struggling with homelessness or addiction, and I would start conversations, listen to people's stories, and buy them lunch, give them a ride, or help connect them with resources to help them, sharing about Jesus with each individual I met. People would invite me to see where they were staying, concrete tubes on the side of the parkway, holes in the woods with a roof of sheet metal, broken down cars in the junkyard, etc. One day, as I was returning from giving a homeless person a ride, I saw a guy in a ShopRite grocery store uniform riding a little non-motorized scooter down the highway as fast as he could. I prayed, I turned around, and I pulled over in front of him, inviting him to hop in. He gladly entered the passenger seat, saying, "God bless you, brother," in an obvious Southern accent. He asked for a ride to work, and I drove him a few miles up the road to ShopRite. He said his name was AG, and we exchanged phone numbers, and I would go on to invite him to church for the next few months. Eventually, AG came to church with me. And after a year or two of him being in and out of our ministries, he chose to get help with some of the personal challenges with alcohol he was going through at that time. He spent a year at Keswick, a Christian rehab, and later exited to live with Pastor Joe and Alyssa. He went through many ups and downs, but the beautiful story here is how taking a risk to meet a stranger in a moment of need can result in 100 other doors being opened and connections being made and lives being changed. And AG went on to be a consistent friend and continued to display radical kindness and generosity. Meanwhile, Colin was starting up a halfway house for the homeless with a primary focus on helping young men aging out of foster care. This would be called the Kingdom Discovery House, named such because he wanted every young man to discover their identity, their value, their purpose in the kingdom of God. We filmed a commercial for the project together, and as soon as we had the funds and the green light to move into the house, I was completely committed to seeing this house succeed and seeing lives impacted through it. I made up a title for myself as resource manager, and I saw to it that we filled the house with donations, couches, tables, pots, pans, and a kitchen and basement full of food donations. I had gone to a dozen different food pantries in order to stock up and have more than enough of whatever we needed. Frozen meals, canned soups, coffee cakes, etc. And I started out sleeping in the closet so that I'd be out of the way and so that we could fill up all the other rooms with people that needed somewhere to stay. Eventually, I was moved to a couch in the basement instead. Some folks that Colin knew began staying at the house, and I went around town to pick others up that needed somewhere to live. I had shared my personal phone number around as a homeless shelter and began regularly receiving calls from churches, police departments, and concerned family members looking to help homeless folks. For example, a gentleman was released from the county jail, and the first number he received was mine. That was Bill. And Bill went on to live at the house for the next year, even running the accounting. He had an MBA. And you could imagine how many people were surprised when a solo teenager in a 1996 Camry rolled up as the one picking up homeless people in the woods, or criminals from jail, or heroin addicts from rehabs. But that's what Jesus called us to do. And many just wanted to make excuses. Sadly, many of those people I met in those days have now died from suicides or overdoses. My experience with the Kingdom Discovery House was a full-time endeavor, consistently meeting with and learning from Colin, giving guys rides, stocking up at food pantries, and organizing the house. The drama you may expect would happen now and then, with residents relapsing on drugs or bringing girls into their rooms or starting fights or one time even bleeding out all over the bathroom floor. He lived, but I had to clean it. The guys appreciated me being there. And one gentleman would always want me to read the Bible with him and help him understand it better. The trouble was that I was an inexperienced 18-year-old and I was dealing with grown men that had years of experience in the streets, in jails, in gangs, etc. And they had very little interest in listening to me. As I tried to keep the house clean, assign chores, etc. As I worked in homeless ministry, I shared what I was doing with many people and I tried to fundraise, but nobody cared enough to donate. So an 18-year-old college student had to be self-funded, going broke trying to help people in need. 16-year-old Kay was the only one that donated to support me, except for Dennis. One day, I was walking past a gentleman, Dennis, somewhere near age 50, at the grocery store. I felt like I should turn around and talk to him. So I introduced myself, and we both shared that we were Christians, and we exchanged contact info. He would often message me to say hi, but I thought it was weird that this 50-year-old guy was messaging me as a teenager. Nonetheless, one day I told him our needs at the homeless shelter, and he picked me up and drove me to Costco. And he said, "Get whatever you need. I'm paying for it." And so I bought hundreds of dollars of supplies that we needed, thanks to Dennis. Even while everyone else was ignoring me and ignoring the needs of our homeless neighbors, Dennis stepped up to give. And that is what a Jesus follower looks like.